All right, folks, thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction. And I want to welcome you. As Rachel said, my name is Carrie Gray, and I'm actually an employee of Rediscover Mental Health, who basically contracts with Lee Summit Cares to provide these webinars. As far as my background goes, I have been working within mental health with individuals and families for 26 years now. And my husband Phil and I also have 4 children of our own, ranging in age. The youngest is 15, then we have a 21-year-old, a 23-year-old, and a 26-year-old. And so oftentimes I share some of the stories of my experiences with teens, just to kind of make things a little more interesting and funny, because it's good to have humor when parenting. And so as Rachel said, our topic today is parenting teens, and this is part 1 of a 2-part series. So in this particular webinar, we're going to focus specifically on teen brain development, as well as the tasks, the developmental tasks that our kids are working to work through as they become adults. And we're going to look at that within the context of our culture, but also within the context of their culture, so that we can get a better understanding of our teenagers as we help them just to navigate through any challenges that come during this time. Finally, at the end, we're going to wrap up with just some warning signs. We know sometimes it's hard to tell with adolescents whether we should be concerned about a behavior. Is this normal, or is this something that I need to maybe seek some professional help or talk to our general practitioner about? And so we'll be sharing some of those things to look for that might alert you that, yeah, it wouldn't hurt to go and talk to someone about what you're seeing there. And so before we jump in, I would like to get some information from you all. And so if you wouldn't mind, there's going to be opportunities for you to engage in this webinar as much or as little as you would like. But it would be helpful to me if you would go to the chat box and enter what the ages are of your children, so that we have a sense of who we're all sharing this webinar with. And so if you could take a minute to do that, and your chat box should be listed on your control panel. Oh, here they come. So we've got 13 and 11, 11, 8 and 6 years, 11, 8 and 6. Well, there's a 13 in each one of these. I wonder what that means. Probably nothing. Oh, wow. So ranging from a 2-year-old to a 14-year-old. And so it looks like, some of you are getting a jump on things. Some of you are right in the thick of things. And so what we will do is provide you with an overview of what you can expect, things that you may already be seeing in your teen. If you have questions along the way, please go ahead and put those in the chat box, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as we move forward. All right. So here is our first thing to consider, another chat box opportunity for you. I'd like you to just sit back and think about, how is today's culture different from the culture in which you grew up in? So meaning, how have things changed since you were a teenager yourself? Go ahead and let's fill that chat box. And so social media, we know, is a huge part, technology, whether that's connecting through social media platforms. It can also be electronics. Some of your kids are likely gaming on those devices. Certainly right now, because of COVID, we have, most kids, at least in our community of Lee Summit, are learning, they're getting educated online as well. So what are some other differences aside from the technology side? It looks like that's the big one that comes to mind there is that technology piece. So let me ask you the second question then. So if our kids are more engaged in technology than we ever were, and let's face it, when I was a kid, we didn't even have cell phones. How does that create challenges for them in terms of just growing up today? Okay, kids are more stuff money than we did growing up. Okay, so that's another impact. And oftentimes, parents will talk about the technology as being a distraction. Kids will get on different apps like TikTok, and it takes up a lot of their time. Adults tend to do the same thing. They might also be exposed to more violence and inappropriate things online. And so, when we first had computers, it was a little bit easier to monitor what they were doing by putting that computer in a centralized location. But now, certainly with smartphones and all the other tools that they have, it gets really hard to monitor. And so the likelihood of them getting in contact with something, as someone put in the chat box, that could be violent or inappropriate is higher, certainly, than it was when we were kids. So let's take a look at that a little bit closer. So when we think about today's culture and how it's different, these are the things that teens themselves have talked about in focus groups when I was working to understand their world. Certainly COVID-19 is having a huge impact on our kids in terms of creating more feelings of loneliness and isolation for many. We know that learning online is not the ideal platform, and we're all very grateful that vaccines are becoming available so that we can begin to transition safely back to that school environment. But kids also talk about technology as being not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, meaning they enjoy communicating and sharing through technology. In fact, when I was a kid, a long time ago, we would go up to the mall, and that's where we would hang out and communicate. Whereas when you think of social media, think of that as your kid's mall or wherever it was that you went when you were young. Some of the challenges, they say, with the technology piece are similar to the challenges that we may face as adults in trying not to compare their experience to that of another person, because those comparisons can cause them to feel sad. Sometimes they see things online that show them things they've missed out on. And so there's two sides to that. Another thing that the teens talk about is the pressure for academic achievement. And how many view it as one pathway to success in terms of college, but we are talking more just as a society as expanding what kids do academically as they move forward into some type of career. We know that college is not the only path, that there's trade schools and there's other ways that kids can have a meaningful career doing something that they love and enjoy doing. We need to keep in mind our orientation to things like sports, as well as musical performance. The concept that our culture often pushes is win, be the best. And parents are willing to put out the money to get their kids additional lessons, tutors, essentially whatever it takes to put their kid up on top. And certainly there's problems with that because very few people are going to become Patrick Mahomes, let's face it. And so if our expectation is, 100% the top, then many of our kids can easily feel like they are not enough. We know that with teens, appearance is important. We know that right now our teens are struggling, of course, outside of our home because we are good role models, but there's not a lot of good societal role models. There's a lot of conflict there and a lot of questions in their minds. There's good role models out there, but it's hard to decipher those. Exposure to violence, someone already mentioned there, and we're hearing more and more kids, the parents talking about concerns about their kids getting addicted to things like online video games, that when they try to take those away, the kids get very angry and sometimes even physical. A few other things that we need to keep in mind is that the mental health is becoming something that we are talking a lot more about, which is absolutely a good thing, because we all, our youth as well as us as adults, have both mental health and physical health, and we really cannot separate the two. They're interdependent. But what we're finding as we look on research in youth and mental health, we're seeing a climbing number of youth who are being diagnosed, if you will, with anxiety disorders, clinical depression. And so that's something for us as parents to keep in mind, so that we can ask that question of where is that coming from? And what can we do to help our kids achieve a better mental health, balance, if you will, more healthy from the mental health side as well as that physical health side. And then finally, of course, exposure to drugs and alcohol continues to be a problem. And in talking to youth, they find it confusing, even when we look at, the discussion on making medical marijuana, for example, legal, lends our teens to believe that that is okay, it's safe for everyone, when we know, in fact, that it can cause our teens to develop problems with addiction that are very hard to break away from. And so keep in mind this teen culture and what they're living in, because oftentimes when people talk about teenagers, they're described as lazy. Kids these days don't know how to work. They don't know how to delay gratification, all right? And so we probably were, the same things were said about us when we were teenagers, that we were lazy, we didn't have a good work ethic, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's important for us to keep in mind the second thing on the slide, and that is that our youth are a reflection of the culture we live in, and we are the ones who created that culture, all right? And so it's important not to blame them or to glorify the past, if you will, but just accept the reality of this is where we are. And hopefully through this webinar, you're going to learn some useful tools into how to help our kids navigate through the society that we've created for them. So one of the things that you can do as a parent is to submerge yourself in their culture. So what does that mean? It means perhaps watching the Netflix series that they're binging on, or sitting down with them while they're getting ready to play the game and learning how that game works. Maybe doing something with them that they enjoy, and they'll just start talking to you about what's happening. Quick story. Years ago, my husband was at Walmart and he was buying a music CD, and he's into very progressive music. And as he was checking out a CD, the young lady who was checking him out said, "Who are you buying this for?" And my husband goes, "Well, it's for me." And she just looked at him and said, "Man, if my parents listened to this type of music, they would understand me a whole lot better." And that just busted me up. So there's something to be said in that. Instead of describing their music as noise and putting it down, try to tolerate it and even go a step further to even listen to the lyrics, because that can give you a good sense of why is my child attracted to this particular type of music, as well as, learning about the types of things they're watching on TV and things like that. The final piece there, and I know that this is difficult during COVID, but providing a space within your home where friends feel welcome to come and just hang out is a wonderful way to get to know these kids and who they're choosing to hang out with. And so if you feed them, they will come. Just keep that in mind. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Water bottles and chips from Aldi will do it every time. All right. So these are some things to keep in mind. But finally, in working with, parents within a clinical setting, there's something that I feel like I need to share, because parents can do, as it says here, all the right things, meaning we can help guide them towards success in school. We can set limits on their behavior. We could be good role models, but yet still have a youth that struggles and makes bad choices. All right. And so that's not a reflection on you as a parent, although I know it's hard to separate the two. And so keep in mind that you can do all the right things and your child still has free will. And so they are going to make decisions on their own that you may not agree with. And so part 2 of this 2-part series is really going to dive deep into what should I do? What can I do when my teenager makes poor choices? So here's some things that we can learn, first of all, as we work to understand our teenagers and the culture that they live in. Now, part 2 is understanding our adolescent, all right? So when you think of adolescence, think of it as a time of transition. And this is really important because our kids are not yet adults and they're not really children anymore. In fact, for girls, about the time they turn anywhere between 10 and 12 years old, they start going into puberty. And that puberty marks the early stage of adolescence. For boys, we know it's a little bit later than that. So it might be from 11 to 13 that they go into puberty. But when that happens, it triggers a major change that happens within their body, as we know, but also within their brain. And we're going to be diving deeper into what that change looks like and how it affects their behavior. The last thing that I want to mention on the slide is that it's very normal during this transition for our kids to fluctuate between childlike and adult-like behavior. It's exciting for them and they want to have more independence. They want to and need to separate some, of course, from their parents. And when they step out into an adult role, if you will, sometimes that gets scary for them. And so you might find that on some days they're acting very responsible and adult-like, then the very next day they seem to be acting like a child. And this happens naturally when they become overwhelmed or fearful. So expect that back and forth to continue throughout this time as they transition to young adults. Now, before I go on with more information, I just want to pause to see if anyone has a question or would like clarification on anything that I've shared so far. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything. So I'm going to keep us, moving forward. And so this next slide talks about the developmental tasks of adolescence, all right? And so kids need to accomplish these things in order to prepare for adulthood. And it's not necessarily a clean linear process, all right? So first, the most obvious one is by mid-adolescence, which is generally between 15 for 17. For most youth, they have completed their physiological growth, meaning that for most of them by this age, they're at the adult height and weight that they'll be for life and are capable of reproducing. So check that off the list. Now here's the problem. Just because our 15-year-old has a full beard doesn't mean that he thinks, feels, or will act like an adult. So just because our adolescents are looking more like adults, it's important for you to know that their thought processes are not there yet. They're not thinking abstractly. They aren't feeling experiences the same way in which we feel them. And so it's important to know that they think and feel differently than we do as adults. For example, if we look at the intellectual task here, we know that by late adolescence, which is 18 to 21 years old, that youth become capable of thinking more abstractly, which means the ability to think critically, to solve problems, to sense what others are thinking. So they're developing some of that emotional intelligence and are able to better regulate themselves within the context of what's happening around them. They're also able to plan for the future, which is so exciting. But here's the kicker. They're still learning how to use these skills. And so it's going to be somewhat inconsistent, but we know that as they get more practice and experience, they're going to get better at it, just like anything else. Emotionally, during adolescence, we know that our youth need to exert their independence. And this is one of the most hard things for us as parents to do, because this requires the child or the adolescents to start distancing themselves from us. It doesn't mean that they don't love us. It just means that they're needing to start separating themselves so that they can figure out who they are and what they want to be. And so during this, you'll probably notice that your kids are pushing the limits to find out where those limits are. They might even act a little contentiously and share much less information. And oftentimes as parents, we go to the absolute worst case scenario. We worry, what's wrong with this kid? Is he or she depressed? Are they doing drugs? Are they hanging out with the wrong people? And the reality is the majority of the time, there's nothing really wrong. It's just the process of separating and becoming their own individual, but it's not easy. But when you think about that separation, it certainly ties into the social piece here. And that is that now our teens are looking less at us as the parent for approval and looking more towards their peers, all right? And it's important because they're going to want to do things to kind of fit in, if you will, at least in early and mid adolescence, until they get to a point where perhaps they're okay with just who they are. But early to mid adolescence, they're going to want to have the shoes that other people have. They're going to want to dress similar to other youth of their age. They're going to get a little bit worried about you behaving well in public, which is actually quite fun because go back to the times when they were little and they would throw a fit at the Target store and everyone was looking at you. Not fun. Now, they oftentimes, at least all of my daughters have at some point or another, kind of looked at me and said, "You're not going to say anything, are you? Are you going to wear that?" And it's like, well, I'll try to control myself. I just don't know. And so it can be a little fun as well. but they're very self-conscious. Some we might refer to them as being a little narcissistic, but that's also a natural part of their development as they are figuring out who they are. Thankfully, they transition through this process, the majority of them unscathed, and the icing on the cake is that they end up becoming you by the time they're about 25, 26 years old. So keep that in mind. Now, here are what I was talking about when I was referring to your child transitioning into an adolescent. The relationship needs to change. And like I mentioned earlier, that can be very difficult for a parent when their child seems kind of moody and standoffish. Maybe they're not wanting to spend as much time with the family. They're wanting to spend more time with their friends. And so you might think of, oh my goodness, I had this wonderful Labrador who I am his best friend. Every time I come in the door, he's wagging the door and so happy to see me. And all of a sudden this light switch went off. And now I've got this grumpy cat who I try to talk to, and half the time it's batting at me with its paw. What did I do? You did nothing. That's a natural. A lot of people are experiencing this alongside you. So you are not alone, parents. So let's look at what we can do. What are some ways in which you can help, yourself, way you can help your teen as you navigate through this time? And I want to start by just asking the question on the screen. What are some of the behavioral changes that you've seen in your teen? So when we think of perhaps going from a Labrador to a grumpy cat or anything in between, maybe you're one of the lucky ones who has a teen that's pretty easy go and things haven't really changed a great deal. But for most of us, we start seeing behavior change. So if you'd like to, go ahead and put anything you've noticed in the chat box. All right. So one parent, is saying spending so much time in her room. That's right. They're wanting to have more privacy. Childlike and adult-like fluctuations, wanting more alone time, fits with that. Not wanting to do things with friends. And so we need to check in on that to see how things are going with friends. We might be going through some transitions there. The arguing, moody, quiet are very much par for the course. Not wanting to do things with family, such as game nights and movie nights. Definitely concerned about what I say in public, all right? And so just to reflect on a few of the things that you mentioned there, it's important as our teens want to spend more times with their friends that we continue to keep the door open and even expect some time with family as well. And so we need to find that healthy balance, if you will. An example would be perhaps pre-COVID, if you had a child who likes to sleep over at friend's house, and they would be happy to do that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday if you'd let them. As long as you're comfortable with them being at that friend's house, we could set a limit by saying you're welcome to sleep over on a Friday or a Saturday, you decide. And we could also say, and we're going to have dinner together at such and such time, or we're going to do this family thing on such and such day. Or we could say, hey, we're going for a walk. Do you want to join us? And so we don't want to assume that just because the teen is wanting to spend more time with their friends, that they don't want to be around us. All right, so keep that door open. Also, if you're noticing some conflict or just your teens not wanting to spend time with their friends, that would be an opportunity just to kind of check in with them to see if anything happened. Because teenage, friendships can be very tricky. And so oftentimes bringing up those conversations when doing something that the teenager enjoys can be a helpful way of getting them talking about how are things going, and even sharing maybe even some of the challenges that you experienced when you were growing up as well. They might not think that you experienced those things, but over time, they'll start to notice your wisdom. Believe me, it does happen. All right, so let's look at our next slide here. So here's a summary for you. We talked about some of the things that you might be noticing. We know that our teenagers have a more difficult time controlling their emotions. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, because of how their brain is being formed and developing, they actually experience their emotions much more intensely than we do. And so it is not helpful when they're in an emotional place to say something like, wow, you're really making a big deal out of nothing. Or, you know, you really don't really have problems to worry about. You don't have bills to pay, a job to worry about. So minimizing what they're feeling is not helpful. Trying to identify and empathize with them is helpful and also helps them to calm down. We also know that teens do not plan well or consider the potential consequences of their actions. Thankfully, they start to develop this ability over time. And so it's important as parents that when they make poor choices, that we allow for logical consequences that teach, that help them hopefully to make a better choice next time. But we also know that oftentimes kids will make the same poor choice several times before they change their behavior. It's not necessarily a one and done situation. We know that our teens prefer high excitement and low effort activities. And so when they are home, they're certainly going to gravitate more towards playing video games or getting on social media over doing their math homework or any other homework or chore that they need to do. And so we can recognize that they're naturally going to go to those things, but we can also set some limits there. You're welcome to do X, Y, and Z as soon as these things are finished. We know that our teens engage in more risky, impulsive behaviors, which can unfortunately include experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And so within our webinar library on YouTube, there's a wonderful webinar that is specifically for parents talking about substance use. And so if you'd like more information on that and how you can make a positive difference there, I encourage you to check out that webinar. But we also know there's some positive to our kids in being willing to engage in more risky, impulsive behaviors. And the silver lining in that, folks, is that they would never leave home if they weren't willing to take risks. And we all want them to leave home and be self-supported, efficient human beings someday who contribute back to society. So when your kid is making not such good decisions, keep that in mind with the logical consequence, but also find ways for them to take risks in areas that are less risky, if you will, in terms of like joining a new club at school or trying something different. Those are great places to take risks that may not, certainly aren't going to have possibly devastating consequences. So there's some information on that that ties into many of the things that you spoke about when you answered that question. Now I have a fill in the blank and I don't think I've given the answer to you yet, but I may have. This part has to do with our brain facts. And so in the chat box, if you think you know the answer to this question, the brain is not completely developed until about what? Oh, the chat box is filling up. Let's see what we've got here. 25 and 100% to all of you, right? Wow. You know, and that's why when you go to rent a car, you cannot rent a car until you are 25 years of age. Some might argue even a little bit older than that. But believe me, they've done the analytics on this and they know when the risk is enough to start renting those cars. So keep that in mind, not fully developed till about age 25. We know that the beginning of puberty, which for girls is younger than boys, marks the onset of many complex organizational changes in the brain. And I'm going to show you an MRI in just a minute so you can see that. We know that the process of brain maturation involves a process where connections are solidified between different areas of the brain. The connections that are not used are lost or pruned. All right. So think about it this way. Perhaps you're someone who took a foreign language while you were in high school, maybe even in college. But let's say if you just took it in high school and you didn't do anything with it, you probably lost that ability. You might recognize some phrases, some words, but the idea here is that our brain creates connections, neural pathways based on what we use, whereas those things we're not using, those connections start to disappear, all right? And that is a cool thing in many ways because an adolescent brain is very pliable and adaptable. And so this is where resilience comes in, where we can work to teach our kids resilience practices and helping them to adapt to situations in different ways. It also makes it easier for them to learn new things than it would for us as an adult to learn new things. We're going to probably have to work a little bit harder at that. But another thing to keep in mind, two more things before I move forward here, is that the brain develops from back to front. Here's the deal. The frontal cortex, which is responsible for planning, problem solving, and impulse control, is the last to mature. All right. The amygdala, known as the pleasure reward center, is responsible for emotions and is fully developed by mid-adolescence, while the frontal lobes are still in flux. So what does that mean? Our kids are going to have the tendency to think before they act, or no, totally opposite. They're going to have the tendency to act based on their emotion and what feels good rather than what they need to be doing or what's best for them in a certain, specific situation. And you can use that example that I provided earlier, where they'd rather play video games than do their homework. They're going to be drawn in that way. And part of it is because of their brain and how it's developing. I do caution that we do not want our youth to use that as an excuse for behavior, but rather that we, the parent, become that frontal lobe for the teen in places where the teen is not able to set limits themselves yet, or is just not willing to do so. And I put this in here, this particular slide, which is an MRI of the brain, to just show you an example of a young brain, which you can see on the left side of the screen. This is a 5-year-old, and you can see the transformation that happens over that period of time. And so it's very critical because what's happening there in that adolescent's brain has a direct impact on how they're behaving. And so we do need to keep that in context as we look at how do we shift our parenting style to meet the need of the adolescents. And so this teenage mouse cartoon is pretty accurate when we think of a lot of adolescents and how they view some possible risks in their environment. All right, so what can we do about this? And this is kind of a preview to what we're really going to jump into a lot deeper next month. And that is tips for navigating for parenting the adolescent. And so the first thing that you can do to help them is to allow for more independence and also more responsibility. And it's not a black or white, your kid is ready for X, Y, or Z, but rather dependent on each individual kid. Some kids are ready to take on more responsibilities, like driving a car, for example, than other kids are. And so you have to decide what's best, for your kid, given who they are. You know that child the best. Typically, kids or teenagers should have more independence than they currently have, but less independence than they want. All right. So if that doesn't make things even more gray, I don't know what will, other than that this is kind of a dance that needs to happen between the parents and the teenager. So for example, you might say, you're allowed to go over to your, friend's house, when it's safe, obviously, but you need to be back at such and such time. So the kid gets back 10 minutes early, high five, great. Another kid comes back 20 minutes late. Oh man, it looks like maybe they weren't ready for that. And so perhaps the friend comes to your place next time. That's just a very simple, one simple example. But another thing to think about here is, what does this teenager need to be able to know how to do before he or she leaves home? And when I'm referring to that, I'm talking about chores or contributions to the home. And so having our teens, having kids of any age pitch in does two things. One, it helps prepare them, they become responsible, and it also builds their self-confidence and helps them to feel like, hey, I'm part of this family, I'm part of this team, I am needed. And when they leave the home and it's time to do their laundry, they're not overwhelmed by that because they've already practiced for that at home. And there's more information on this within our webinar library. I believe it's called The Family Team. So if you want some tips on making that happen, even with a teenager, that's where you'll find that resource. We also need to adapt our role as a parent to meet the changing needs of our adolescent. So when our kids are young, those first few years, it's all about, well, and it still is to some degree, keeping them safe, setting limits on needs and wants, trying to figure out what the kid is good at and getting them resources to help develop that interest further. But as our kids get into, high school, in particular, I think middle school too, our role needs to start changing. So think in terms of a consultant. When you think of a role of a consultant, whether you're bringing them into your business or bringing them into your home to consult with you, maybe even on a remodeling project, put in the chat box, what is the role of a consultant? What are some of the things that a consultant does if they're a good one? Awesome. We've got some people starting to comment now. And so a good consultant is somebody who has some expertise in an area. So I'm sure that that would be based on experience. They know what doesn't work, what does work. Advice, great word. Here's some advice, or here are some suggestions. We also know that the first thing that a consultant is going to do is they're going to listen to us. And listening can be very hard, especially with teenagers, because oftentimes when a kid starts experimenting with different thought patterns or values, we tend to try to jump in there and just control and change their thinking, which only makes them adhere to that value even more. And so a consultant is someone who listens, seeks first to understand without judgment, but then also provides suggestions. And so when the adolescent makes a poor choice, which we know they will, we step back and we provide empathy and we listen. We ask, how do you think you're going to solve this problem? We are there to provide them with ideas. Would you like some ideas? And because we're a consultant, they get to decide what they're going to run with to solve that problem. I often, with my kids growing up, I would use the word experiment. Well, you could give this a try and see how it works. And by using the word experiment, as a child went through that problem-solving process and selecting something to try, we knew that if the experiment didn't work out in the way they hoped it would, we'd just come back and reevaluate. And so that's a great way to help your adolescent to develop critical thinking skills. Allowing for your adolescent to make what is referred to as affordable mistakes and experience natural consequences is a wonderful way to help prepare them for life in the real world. The other positive thing about that is when our kids make poor choices and have to suffer the consequences of those choices, they're more likely to think about their next choice. And so choices and consequences is like cause and effect. If I do this, this could happen. I did that once before. I didn't like it. I'm not going to do it again. So you can see how that cause and effect thinking can help our kids in terms of peer pressure, being able to say no to negative influence. The last two things here are, number one, keeping the lines of communication open. Always seek first to understand where your kid is coming from. If they're upset or just need to talk about something, that doesn't mean that you agree. It just means that you care about them, you love them, you want to hear things as they see it to get a better understanding. If you're not sure what they're saying, paraphrase back to them what you think they are saying so that you can have that clarification. And from there, we're modeling also how they can listen respectively to others as they work together to have a conversation, or maybe it's within your home to talk about wanting a later curfew or something like that. And so it sets the stage for that. Then finally, the last piece here is totally critical, and that is you as a parent need to take good care of yourself, all right? And so by modeling good self-care, we also teach our kids to take good care of ourselves. So for example, if we say to our teenager, I'll be glad to pick up the materials you need for your project as long as I know at least 48 hours in advance, and our kid totally drops the ball and comes to us at 8 o'clock, the evening before the project's due, it's going to be hard, but that's when we need to say, oh man, I'd be happy to bring you to pick up the materials you need when you give me more notice, all right? Or I'd be happy to clean the clothes that you put in the laundry basket when they're in the laundry basket. Or you're welcome to eat what I've served for dinner, or you can help yourself to a big breakfast tomorrow. So those are some suggestions on things that you can do to set limits while taking care of you as a parent. Now, does anybody have any questions as we get closer to wrapping up our presentation today, our webinar? Listed here are some things to look out for, all right? And so if you start seeing things like this in your teen, and it's not related to, COVID, for example, and it could be related to COVID if a kid's feeling isolated and really struggling with the online platform. Now is the time then to reach out and talk to someone about getting help. And oftentimes people will start with their general practitioner, or many of us have, behavioral health or mental health benefits through our employers, like an employee assistance program. And when in doubt, it's good just to go with the teen, to an appointment to express the types of behaviors that you're noticing, so that a professional can kind of help guide you through that to see if that child needs additional resources. And so that's a suggestion that I make there. And these slides, of course, are going to be on this webinar when it is posted to our YouTube channel. So if you need to go back to that at any time, you can. Then finally, these are some resources that I often utilize in, just staying informed about issues related to parenting and raising children. And so you'll see just a combination of things from where to get good information, like from the Child Mind Institute, places to call if you're concerned about your child's behavior. Maybe you find that they're using substances. If you have concerns about friendships, bullying, is this a healthy relationship or not? Stopbullying.gov is a wonderful resource. And of course, we're all a little concerned about screen time and technology. We know it's here to stay, but as parents, we want to do our part to help our kids to navigate how to use that technology and how to set limits on technology use. And so Common Sense Media is a great resource for that. And of course, Lee Summit Cares is where we post information about all of our upcoming webinars and parenting classes. And so this slide here wraps us up just by sharing some information with you about the next webinar that will take place on the 16th. And so, as I said, that's where we're going to really get into more discipline strategies. And I recognize that many of you have older children, but some of you do have younger children. And so our next Love and Logic Magic for Early Childhood class will start on Thursdays. And then we are going to have a webinar talking about sports and performance and how we can help our kids become champions for life, whether they win or lose. And so I hope you'll consider joining in on those in the future. So does anybody have any questions before we log off for today? I'm certainly glad that you could all be here and that you take the time to be a part of this discussion. And I'm very happy to share, this information with you and hope that you'll come back. And certainly want to encourage you to check out those resources at the Lee Summit Cares YouTube channel. I think we have about 12 different topics related to parenting, to managing mental health, stress, change, uncertainty, and all the things that we seem to be dealing with today. All right. Well, thank you for joining. I'm going to go ahead and stop our webinar. And like I said earlier, if you'd like to watch again in the future, you can go to the YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us.